Right, we are live. So I'm seeing people come in. Welcome everyone to Virtual Lighthouse Books. It's absolutely lovely to have you here tonight. My name is Jess, and I'll be looking after the evening from the Lighthouse point of view. I hope you're all sitting comfortably wherever you are in the world, and do feel free to pop in your a quick hello in the chat and say where you're sitting in the world. That's always really nice, especially at the moment when everything can feel a wee bit disconnected. So tonight I'm really delighted to welcome you to listen to two extraordinary writers, thinkers, and I would say also very concerned human beings. The two books that we'll be hearing from and about tonight, I think, are really quite brave. And the reason I think that is because they dare to look at the really big stories. The stories that I think most of us can feel are too far away, or maybe don't impact us in this part of the world on an everyday basis, or they can simply feel like they're too much even for our brains to handle. And both books also highlight the incredible importance of storytelling and of the very words that we use to face the existential crises that we are experiencing and will experience in the years to come. So before I just do a wee run through of the evening, I'm just going to introduce you to our speakers. We've got a very big welcome to Andri Snaer Magnason, who's an Icelandic writer and documentary filmmaker. Andri has written novels, poetry, plays, and short stories, as well as essays. And amongst these is the book Dreamland, which instigated quite an intense debate on environmental issues in Iceland. And this latest book, which I've got here, is On Time Water, which has just been shortlisted for the Nordic Council's Literary Prize of 2021. And I was just saying that as a Swedish person, I know that's a very big deal. So that's brilliant. We also have David Farrier. Welcome, David. David teaches at the University of Edinburgh, where he's also the personal chair for literature and the environment. And he's the author of, most recently, I should say, because he's written other books as well, this incredible book called Footprints, which won the Royal Society of Literature's Giles and Oban Award for non-fiction. This is very exciting, and we'll be starting with a reading from Andri, followed by a conversation. Later will also be, there will be plenty of time for questions. So we'll hear a reading, we'll hear David and Andri chat for a bit, we'll hear a reading from David, and at the very end, we will have some questions. So feel free throughout the event to put your questions in the Ask a Question box at the bottom of the screen. And I should say as well that there's a little banner that's popped up which says buy the book. That means buy the books. So you can buy both of these books on our website. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Andri Snaer Magnason.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, you can buy the books without sending posters to space. That's a good idea. So yeah, great meeting you. I really miss you in person. I love Edinburgh. I've been there a few times, and it's actually, I think it's the shortest distance we can travel from Iceland. It's about 1,000 kilometers.
Okay.
That is kind of the shortest place in the real world that we can travel. So my book is On Time Water, and I'm going to read a short chapter that kind of captures the time aspect of the book. So because the book is mixing kind of personal stories, science, mythology, and this is my personal point of view of time. The phone rings and Grandma Hulda runs to answer it. We sit down to eat pancakes as the radio hums low in the background. I ask Hulda Philippia, my daughter, to do a little maths puzzle. How old is your great-grandma if she was born in 1924? She's 94, Grandma Hulda replies immediately. Fast math, I say. Well, I know how old she is, Hulda grins. All right, but now you'll really have to do some sums. When will you be 94? So it would be the year I was born, 2008, plus 94. Exactly. She takes a piece of paper and a pen and looks skeptically at the sheet. She shows me the result as though it must be a misunderstanding. Is that really right? 2102? Yes, and hopefully you will be as energetic as Grandma Hulda is now. Maybe you'll even be living in this same house. Maybe your 10-year-old great-granddaughter will be visiting, sitting with you in this kitchen in 2102, just like you are sitting here right now. Yes, maybe, says Hulda, sipping a glass of milk. One more equation. When will your great-granddaughter be 94 years old? Hulda writes some figures on a piece of paper with a little help. Would she have been born in 2092? Yes? Okay, 2092 plus 94 is 2186. She laughs at the thought. Yes, can you imagine that? You, born in 2008, might know a girl who will still be alive in the year 2186. Hulda purses her mouth and looks into the air. Can I go now? She asks. Almost, I say. One more puzzle. How long is it from 1924 to 2186? Hulda does the math. Is it 262 years? Imagine that. 262 years. That's the length of time you connect across. You'll know the people who span this time. Your time is the time of the people you know and love, the time that molds you, and your time is also the time of the people you will know and love, the time that you will shape. You can touch 262 years with your bare hands. Your grandma taught you. You will teach your great-granddaughter. You can have a direct impact on the future, right up to the year 2186. Imagine that.
Thank you, Andrew. That's a wonderful passage in the book. I love that moment in your book. That seems to encapsulate so much of what the book is about, and the effect that it has on, I think, on readers as well. Before we jump in, I'd just like to say thank you to everyone for coming along and supporting Lighthouse Books, supporting us, but supporting the bookshop as well. It's so important, I think, that we all support independent bookshops, particularly at times like these. And so your support is really valued. But Andri, thank you so much for that reading. It's a wonderful book. I love so much about it. I love the sense of place that you conjure. You really do feel like you visited Iceland, I think, at the end of reading it. But I love the generosity of it as well. It has a really marked imaginative generosity, both in terms of the way it approaches place and culture. That another thing that really stayed with me is your the way you draw our attention to the fact that the word for connection in Icelandic is the same word for connection in Sanskrit, I think, which is an astonishing revelation.
Yes, it's quite interesting. Samband. It means the same. Yeah.
But it has a wonderful contemporary generosity as well. It's a generosity towards time and towards our place in time, and it's expressed nowhere better than in the passage you read. I'd like to start by asking you about how and why you approach the problem of time by thinking about families, thinking about your own family. You seem to feel that it's the most intimate stories that connect us with the future, the deep future of the planet. So I wonder if you could talk about that.
Yes, well, this is the challenge that I think we're all dealing with, each in our own ways. How do you just get this overwhelming data? And I was thinking, why do we not connect when a scientist says 2070? And maybe it's a bit selfish in a way. and why do I really think of polar bears or something distant, non-connected when we're talking about the future of the planet? How has the discussion evolved almost like it's not about us, it's about something else, someone else? So I wanted to take it home and just see my personal connection to this, and it's super simple actually, just because I think it's strange that our generation is raised with the year 2000 as a far away, distant future. So the ruling paradigm of our generation was 2000, and then we're in the zeitgeist where we pretend to be young. When my grandfather was 50, he referred to himself as an old man. I still want to be a boy. I want to start training for Ironman after 5 years. So we're in this age denial, and we don't really want to be confronted with that the year 2000 was actually 20 years ago, because that's a really hard fact for our identity as young people. So the universities are full of people born in the year 2000, but they have not shaped yet the paradigm of the future. So the paradigm of the future is the year 2000, and Trump was president, and all these people that don't really connect to the 21st century. But my daughter, she's paying into a pension fund now. She's working. I just drove her to work, and she's paying into a pension fund every hour now, expecting to get money in the year 2070. So I just thought we have to start updating and the relationship with this century that we haven't really done. So 2160, that's within the reach of my daughter, and it's super simple math. It's almost not an idea. It's so simple. But strangely, it is not kind of in our paradigm, in our culture, to think in this way.
Yeah, that we're very much kept in thinking in very short term ways. I think you're right. I mean, but you also make the point that the entire history of Iceland, I think you say, it effectively is can be encapsulated in 12 successive generations of women. You say, and to think that you could have, that's the number of people you could gather around a table and have a meal with and talk with over an evening. To think that we might connect to 12 generations into the future and have that same intimacy with them as if we could gather them around a table with us is I think, astonishing and a necessary revelation.
And I also thought that it becomes so speculative if I'm talking about my grandchild, because she's not born, and sci-fi is always infested with technology and lenses and age pills or something. Or just like it's like the future is about gadgets or something, but the future, I thought, is about continuing to be human, and success is if we can have pancakes with our grandchildren within some kind of a stable planet. The success is not about the gadgets that we've created or flying cars or something.
Yeah.
So I wanted to make pancake sci-fi, and that's this chapter is pancake sci-fi. So it's not, our goal is not to become cyborgs or vanish into some data server, but just to continue sharing stories with neighbors or offspring, or just to continue to be human, and that's kind of the raw aspect that I wanted to bring into the book.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, you say that you didn't want to pursue a kind of science fiction perspective, and in fact, what you say at one point is that to say we live in a mythological time is not an exaggeration. What could you say a bit more about that? What do you see about right now that is resonant of myth?
Yeah, so like if we read the Bible, we can read that Moses, he split the Red Sea, and that was such an accomplishment that we remember that, 3,000 years later. I don't remember when he did it, but a few thousand years later, we remember that accomplishment of splitting the Red Sea for a part of a day. Now we're having this G7 conference, and they're discussing if the whole oceans of the world should raise 1 meter, 2 meters. They're discussing how they are melting glaciers. Napoleon did not discuss that. Ramses II, he was probably megalomaniac, but I don't think he really thought he could melt glaciers, because he couldn't melt glaciers. He just could not do that. But the leaders of today, they can melt glaciers. They can write laws where you either melt glaciers or you don't melt glaciers. They can put money into technology or into directions that either melt or don't melt glaciers. The acidification of the oceans is changing more in 100 years than in the previous 50 million years. And that's 10 times that is a single human being born today is experiencing a greater change of the world oceans than not all the previous generations of man, if we believe man is 5 million years old, but 10 times the generations of man. So that's mythology. So I thought history is about ideas. History is about empires, trade routes, culture, religions. Mythology is when you're pulling the moon over the sky and creating worlds or destroying worlds. And we're possibly witnessing these tragic gods that created these amazing machines, these magical inventions of flying things and self-driving cars and etc. But eventually, we're asking, do they have control over these devices or not? Or can they only create these inventions and then these inventions have their life cycle of their own and just eventually cover us up? Like you were writing in your book about the road god.
Oh yeah.
The road god that was so hungry that he eventually swallowed everything.
Yeah.
So I felt like mythology was the only kind of relevant point of scaling up language. The only way to explain this was mythology, because it can't be explained with normal historical context. Actually.
I think that's a really important point. I mean, it is a problem of scale, having the imaginative capacity to think about problems on the scale that we face. But I think you're right to say that we need to be mindful that so many of the myths that have come down to us have been stories of hubris, of people overreaching themselves and coming to sticky ends. Obviously, ice is a hugely important part of the story you're telling. In terms of the ecology of Iceland, but also I get the impression, and personally as well, it's very much about a family and a personal relationship with ice. I wonder if perhaps you could tell us about how would you describe your relationship with ice right now in Iceland?
Yes, so Iceland is half the name is ice. So what is Iceland without ice? It's just land, and that's kind of boring. So Iceland is covered. About 10% of Iceland is glacier, and if you would spread these glaciers evenly on top of the island, then we would be under about 30 meters of ice. So the mass of ice that is here is enormous. And my grandparents, they were kind of the first generation that kind of could explore the glaciers, had the strength, had the resources, technology to actually enjoy the glaciers. Just barely the generation beyond where every single calorie they consumed was about getting the next calories, like
Right.
fishing or farming. So people didn't have so much left for leisure or travel or so this generation they founded the Icelandic Glacial Research Society, and my grandparents' honeymoon was a 3-week glacial research trip on Vatnajökull Glacier, which is 10,000 square kilometers. It's a huge mass of ice, and that ice cap did not have names. So one of the highest peaks of that glacier is named after my grandmother. It's called the Bride's Belly, where they snowed in. So I could use my grandmother not only as a measuring stick for time, because she's turning 97 in 2 weeks, and she's in really good shape, and we can just talk about everything. But I can use her as a measurement of time. So within the time, so when she was exploring the glaciers were in a context of eternity. The glaciers, the clouds, the rocks. Just they could not imagine the ice to be fragile, because you're standing, under your feet you have 3 Empire State Buildings of ice. And stretching hundreds of square kilometers, over the horizon. And to imagine that this is actually fragile, that within the time somebody born today reaches the age of my grandmother. That's Earth leaving geological speed and entering human speed, and again it's mythological. It's the great melt. It's in 1,000 years. This is a milestone in human history that is before and after Christ, before and after ice. This is a moment in not only in human time but in geological time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a moment when you say that there'll come a point in the near future when a glacier is as rare as a Bengal tiger is today, and to think about the loss of ice as something that we should see as comparable to species loss is, I think, a really striking, really eye-opening way to put it. I mean, you were involved as well in writing and producing the Okjukul Glacier Memorial, which is a memorial for the first glacier in Iceland to be lost to the climate crisis. And there's now a plaque there where the ice was, addressing future generations. I think that the wording is if I paraphrase, that we know what we need to do. Only you will know if we did it. I mean, I find that my book is so much about how we might think about and address future generations, and so to have actually done it, I'm fascinated at what that was like, at what went through your mind when somebody commissioned you to write a message to future generations.
It's actually, I felt like I was writing a future fossil.
Yes,
because you've gone through, I think you were writing in your book about what materials will last, and actually the copper shield will probably last longer than the stone it's placed on, because the stone will weather away in some time, but the copper is so stable unless somebody scavenges it and makes some use of it in the next 500 years. So I was thinking, when you go to these graveyards and you see like a grave from 1500 or 1600, I was thinking, I'm talking to somebody maybe in 200-300 years that might stumble upon that mountaintop and read this. And I was thinking, what language will they understand? The Icelandic? Will that still be a language in 300 years? So it's in Icelandic and English. Probably English will still be in 300 years, I guess. But nobody knows really. So I was talking both to people now, reading this now, but I was also talking to people maybe coming after 300 years, and it took a long time to kind of crunch this. Okay, wow, I'm writing a eulogy for something that should be eternal. How do you write a eulogy for clouds or an ocean or like so just something that you don't feel is in the context of vulnerability or temporality. So I did some experiments. I wrote one in a metric form from the 12th century. Actually older one from around the year 1000. I found a metric form that the Eddaic poetry was written in. Wow. And the name of the glacier is strangely multi-faced poetic. It's so Ok, of course, it's the international name of OK. So the name is ironic because OK is not OK anymore.
Okay.
But Ok also means burden, or it means like a yoke. So under the yoke of Pinochet, you would say, living in the yoke of the Soviet Union, So it's also that, and it's also, but that word comes from the beams that are used to carry water. So the yoke. So Ok, it used to carry water, but now that water is gone, and it has become a yoke of future generations because it will flood your harbors, your beach properties, and it's not okay anymore. so it has like three-dimensional meanings. Only the single word, and that made it also more of a challenge, and also more use for poetry.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I just love the kind of connections you discover in language. For me, that really drives home the poignancy, I think, and the urgency of what you're talking about. If it's all right, I'm just going to read something briefly now. It seems like a good moment because the short passage I wanted to talk about is also about language, but it's about how memory might be carried in language and how we might be surprised at language's potential to remember. So the background to this is I have a chapter about the way that coral reefs are threatened by ocean warming and acidification. And I visited the Great Barrier Reef in Australia and also spent some time with a reef scientist called Jodie Webster. And this is an account of a conversation that we had and where that led. Because the background to the conversation is that well, actually, I'll just read this bit, which will explain it, I think, well enough. Sea level has been stable since around 7,000 years ago, said Jodie. But during the last glacial maximum, about 21,000 years ago, it was 120 meters below what it is today. The shoreline extended in places to the reef's current position at the edge of the continental shelf. What is now a shallow sea, sheltered by the outer reef, was then a habitable plain. This time is still remembered in some indigenous cultures, Jodie said. I wrote down what he told me, although it seemed incredible that a vanished landscape could remain preserved in language for so long. In general, linguists suggest that cultural memories can't persist beyond 500 years, 800 at most, without the core information being lost beneath layers of later embellishments like those that have hidden the historical authors of the Odyssey from us. But there are numerous stories among the indigenous groups around the Queensland coast that recount the time when the shoreline lay where the barrier reef now stands. A Gunganji story remembers when a man called Gunya, who lived near Yarrabah, now Cape Grafton, ate a forbidden fish. This angered the gods, who caused the sea to rise and drown the land. Gunya and his family escaped to higher ground, but the sea never retreated to its former limit. Memories of this time also seem to be sedimented in language. The Yidinji name for Fitzroy Island is Gabar, meaning lower arm, which suggests it was once a promontory. The word for island, Jarraway, means small hill. The stretch of water between Fitzroy and King Beach is called Mudaga, the name for the pencil cedars that once must have grown there. These stories and place names represent an astonishing feat of geographical memory, recalling a landscape that hasn't existed for at least 7,000 years. There's nothing in classical or indeed any other world literature that can compare with the memory feats performed by the Gunganji and Yidinji peoples. Their stories and place names devastate the conventional wisdom that, without writing, language is a poor, leaky receptacle in which to carry memories into the deep future. They raise the prospect that our descendants, in turn, might dream epic fables to explain, for example, the presence of strange city islands rotting in the shallow seas that will cover what was once our coastline. Perhaps the Great Barrier Reef will persist as a fossil presence in the language and legends of the distant future, talked by the pressure of time into new mythic shapes.
This was one of my favorite chapters because I just this is totally fascinating that just imagine that something could have lasted 20,000 years in oral memory, and also do you remember how quickly that sea level rose?
Not precisely, but in geological terms, it was fairly rapid. I think between about, say, 12,000 and 7,000 years ago. So you're seeing sea level rise over only several thousand years on a really quite impressive scale.
Yeah, because I love this passage also because because there you have 20,000 years, and I was thinking, in my book I'm writing about the idea of the world starting with a frozen cow.
Yeah,
and that is a memory that is in Icelandic manuscripts since 1,000 years ago. And I find this strange connection because the source of the Ganga is a glacier called Gomuk, and that means the mouth of the cow. And the idea of a glacier as a source of life that suddenly comes to our mind, or it becomes obvious suddenly. But it was probably always obvious, and I was wondering, could that be relevant? That had, gone from India to Iceland and taken still been remembered as a myth 2,000 years later, but there you have something 20,000 years later.
Yeah.
And yes, so also this fact, so I also felt like there was both hope and pessimism in it, because at one point the Great Barrier Reef was not where it is now. That is because the floods came, and eventually it came back, and now we're just faced with this utter destruction of I think, if I saw this graph where if we reach 1.5 in 5 degrees, then we will lose 70 to 90% of the coral reefs. If we reach 2 degrees, then they're all lost. And I was so shocked when I read this, because I could not recall headlines telling us, the leaders of the world just agreed that we could do without coral reefs.
Yeah. And it's not just coral reefs. I mean, I think you make the same point that in your book, 25% of marine life depends on coral reefs. If we are prepared to lose coral, we're prepared to empty the oceans, and the consequences for all life on the planet is I think beyond my comprehension if we're thinking about species loss on and biodiversity loss on that scale. Yeah,
and also that happens before we put, any draconian measures on how big cars we can drive, or so it's just basically we're almost totally cushioned still, deciding this. So this kind of overwhelming scale of destruction that we kind of have allowed to happen, while at the same time we haven't put in any laws, or so it's like the cause and then the reaction that we have is totally, and that's what I felt like your book was not shouting at us, but kind of sideways, kind of trying to raise our awareness of.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, yeah, I'm not a shouty person, so maybe that's why. But my hope is, and it's very much related to the story you were telling of doing Pancake sci-fi and that calculation with your daughter, is that we need to puncture that sense that we're kind of separated from the crisis that is unfolding. And for me, I think we're surrounded by reminders of this, if only we would pay attention to it. Almost anything that, you have around you right now, and, speaking to you, of course, Andri, but anyone who's joining us, we're surrounded by materials that have the potential, because of their durability, but also their abundance, to become a future fossil, to leave an imprint in the future fossil record. And it may not be this precise pen, but something like it, another kind of plastic object. There is so much of this stuff. We've cast 500 billion tons of concrete just since World War II. And most of that is concentrated in our major cities. So those are guaranteed impressions in the fossil record. And for me, carrying that awareness means that, anything that we encounter, any object, any material we encounter, even the most banal everyday thing, can remind us of our connection to the very deep future, to connect us to generations to come. The fact, it reminds us that our reach in terms of time is not limited to our own lives. And I'm glad that you mentioned the point about hope and pessimism, because my feeling about future fossils is their stories. What we're doing now, we're telling stories to the future. We're telling a story to the future about what we valued and what we didn't. Did we value coral reefs enough to save them, or did we value other things more? Yeah. And in some cases, we're making fossils that we're leaving things that will last a very long time. Our nuclear waste, our cities, our plastic, the carbon that we've put in the atmosphere that will still be there in 100,000 years' time, or a proportion of it. But in other cases, there are stories that have yet to be determined. It isn't yet guaranteed that we will lose coral reefs. It isn't yet guaranteed that all of Iceland's glaciers will melt. There's a story that's still to be determined and told, and I think the hope comes in there, is when we can ask ourselves, what do we want our legacy to be? What story do we want to tell future generations about what was most important to us?
You went to visit this nuclear waste site in Finland.
Yeah.
That was a thrilling story. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, of course. It's so that's the kind of flip side to the passage I mentioned, because the problem of long-term storage of nuclear waste is that language will erode, and that material that needs to carry a health warning for 10,000 years. We don't have a script, a language that we can be confident will still be understood over that length of time. So there are two schools of thought. In the United States and New Mexico, they're building a deep earth, like a very deep underground repository for this dangerous stuff, and they're going to build some kind of mythological landscape to mark it, of huge monoliths and signs, both kind of declaring that it no one should enter, but also these faces of disgust modeled on Edvard Munch's painting The Scream, which is supposedly, a kind of thing, an image that transcends language. We all understand what it means to an extent. So their idea is that you create a kind of a visual system that repels people and tells them not to indulge their curiosity. But in Finland, in a place called Onkalo, which is the name of their repository, it's being built 0.5 kilometre deep in the bedrock. Their plan is simply to, once it's full, is bury it and leave it to be forgotten, because they don't trust that our curiosity will be checked. They don't trust that any communication system could endure or be effective. And I don't know, but I did have the privilege to visit Onkalo, to go down into one of the deposition tunnels and to see, where this material will be deposited. And, we've been talking a lot about mythological resonances in the present day. It was an astonishingly moving and quite spooky experience, because, I went to various places in writing this book and thought a lot about what our legacy to the future will be. But it was standing in that tunnel 0.5 kilometre deep in the bedrock where I really felt, as if a kind of future visitor was standing right next to me. It was as if I could see what they would see when they broke in and they found, the material, which we hope they don't do. But the pyramids are a lesson in that regard.
And would get this because maybe they want to have. They might have the tools, but maybe not the measuring devices. So they will get this mysterious cursed sickness from.
And then exactly.
I remember this. I think it was mind blowing. So each generation has to remind the next generation that they have to forget the area.
Yes. Yes.
So just remember that you have to forget the area.
Exactly. I know it's a conundrum, isn't it? Absolutely. Yeah. Maybe now will be a good time to go to the.
Did we have audience questions, or should we keep?
If you've got, am I on? Yes, no, yes. If you've got any questions at all, please feel free to pop them in the Ask a Question box. And there's also a wee function where you can vote for the questions that you find most fascinating and that you would like to hear the answer to. Because then, if we've got quite a few questions, we can use that as a way to guide us and sort of choose which questions we're going to answer. We've got one question to start with, which is coming from Natalie. We must evidently rely very heavily on scientists in our current situation, but how would you both underline the importance of artists in the face of the climate crisis? Really good and pertinent question.
David?
Well, I would just go back to what I said earlier, that I see our concrete, our plastic, our nuclear waste, our thinning of biodiversity. These are all stories we're telling the future, I think. And so, stories in general are an essential tool for communication, for shaping connection, for creating community. We are storytelling creatures. I think it's one of the theories of how human societies, even us as a distinct species, emerged was through storytelling, through language, through the kind of feedback loop of learning to tell stories about a wider range of experiences that created a sense of ourselves in our environment and a sense of relationship with each other, and that has only carried on. I think storytelling is our oldest and most vital technology. And when it comes to the climate crisis, we are not poor in information. And although I think a lot of people are perhaps not interested in reading all about the numbers and the scientific reports, it's there if we want it. But perhaps what we need, and I think Andri's book shows us this so beautifully, are stories that can help bring this to a human level and connect it. And for me, as someone who teaches, literature at the university, poetry, novels, artworks are also ways to create that connection across time and space.
I've often asked people, would we be a democracy if there had not been poems, songs, paintings, dance, about democracy, about the fights for independence or democracy or human rights. All of these kind of paradigm shifts and movements have happened both through some kind of a, you could say, theory or university, some kind of intellectual theories, but then it comes through the arts, where it's kind of the multiple dimensions of these ideas are kind of explored and until the paradigm shifts. So it was actually a climate scientist that urged me to write about this. And at first I didn't feel like I had authority. I'm from a family of doctors and nurses, and they would often frown upon, the daily paper giving health advice. Like they would say just, all these laymen that would have, write about health issues, not doctors. So I kind of had this stigma. I felt like, I should keep to my ballpark, but then this climate scientist, he told me exactly this, if you don't feel comfortable to communicate the issue, being a relatively, average citizen, who will feel comfortable communicating it? Because a paradigm shift doesn't happen because one in 1,000 dares to talk about it. All women feel they can talk about women's rights. Every voter feels he can talk about democracy, and that's how I felt also kind of urged to first, like a civil duty, to understand the climate science and then maybe translate it into my own language or my own way of expressing.
That's brilliant. Thank you both. So there's another question that's also gotten quite a few votes, and it's related to this and the idea of communicating and kind of thinking about the big stuff, for lack of a better word. So, I've lost it. There we go. It's from George. I've been so interested in the concept of deep time and flipping it towards the future rather than the past. I find deep time thinking exhilarating, but also overwhelming, difficult, alienating. I'm curious how you both do this deep time thinking, quote unquote, in ways that are instructive without becoming so overwhelmed.
Thank you, George. I think there's two answers to this. I think for me personally, it's a case of kind of becoming reconciled to the idea that deep time is and always has been a part of our everyday lives, and we perhaps don't appreciate that. But we live on a planet with an atmosphere and a climate that has evolved to be conducive to not just to life but to our particular way of life, and that is that's a product of change over unimaginable deep time. So deep time is a part of our everyday already, I think, and that for me at least is it's not comforting, but it helps me to be reconciled to this more, to thinking, well, our intervention in the deep future is not, it's a big change on one level, but on another level, it's simply an expression of the fact that we are creatures of the planet's deep time as well. But it can be overwhelming, and I think we don't have ready-made contexts for thinking about this. Andrew was talking about living in a mythological age, but those myths aren't yet, I think, formalized. And so I've been thinking a lot over the past year with the pandemic and so on, and everything slowing down, about how amazing it would be to have a day set aside, Future Generations Day, where we could all share the kind of stories in Andrew's book, share stories about how we think about future generations, about our own experiences of deep time. I think, and I've even got a day. I mean, if anyone wants to join me, let's go for it. But 16th of July next month is the 76th anniversary of the Trinity test in New Mexico, the first nuclear test. Often linked to the onset of the Anthropocene era, and it would seem to me an ideal candidate for this day, where we have a kind of ritual space, or a kind of a space in which we actively think about. So that's what I think is something we are missing, is that kind of formalized space for addressing this kind of intergenerational aspect of what it means to live in the 21st century.
Yeah. Like David, how do you deal with hope? Because I'm always asked, because I'm involved in these issues, and people ask me, "Do you have hope?" So I just wanted to ask you that question: do you have hope?
I think hope is an obligation in these circumstances, because hope that isn't, I guess, thoughtless. Hope that is considered, hope that is aware of the scale of the challenge. But if we don't have hope, we won't work, and if we don't work, it means we've given up. I think there's, dare I say, something even kind of unforgivable, certainly for someone in my position, with all the privilege that I have, to throw my hands up and say nothing can be done. I think that would be the most appalling dereliction of duty. So I think hope is something we have to cultivate.
Yeah, I agree. I was just wondering, because and actually science confirms that there is hope. That is, science confirms that if science did not confirm it, then it would just say the comet is lasting in 20 years, and there's then we won't have hope. But scientists have told us that within our current technology, and we can actually do things to stop. So I think this 16th of July might be a good day. But I was thinking of, because I was interviewing my grandfather that actually operated on Oppenheimer.
Yes.
So he had him under his knife. And so I could have first-hand kind of encounters, or first-hand stories from Oppenheimer, from my grandfather. And I was thinking of this kind of situation, because Oppenheimer, he said, "I have become death, the destroyer of worlds." But and that's kind of the paradigm of when I was growing up, and I thought, Andropov or Brezhnev or somebody would press the button and blow up the world for us.
Yeah.
But now it's like we all have the button. So we're all in our car. We're pressing the button every day. We have become the destroyer of our worlds, and I think that's also kind of an unbearable dilemma that we're living in, because I think every generation sincerely has thought they were improving the world for their offspring. You build a school for your children, you build a hospital, you build infrastructure, you build roads, you make a harbor. You're always kind of, or you just make your farm bigger or something. You always believe that you're making the world better for your children. But now our children are on the street and they're looking at us and they're saying, "Sorry guys, you are not making the world better for us." And that's a very heart-breaking, interesting kind of flip of generations. So I'm also wondering when this paradigm shift happens, because paradigm shifts happen when you drink something with your mother's milk, and they have taken the climate change, with the mother's milk, while we got to know about this, or kind of the consensus was reached when we were in our 20s, even 30s. So I'm hopeful also that the paradigm shift will happen faster, because the younger generation is not going to. They won't allow this to go on mindlessly. Like in the next 30 years will not be mindlessly like the last 30 years.
No.
So I think we will have some huge hashtag that will frame us in the next, like the Me Too hashtag or something. Like they will learn from. So I think the young generation that went through the coronavirus, where we suddenly found the handbrake, they sacrificed the proms, the school trips, school itself. They will ask, okay, aren't we going to do something real about climate change and something that you really feel on your body, like something disruptive. And I think they will be more open for disruption than we have been.
Yeah.
I'm gonna well, Myri might tell me off because there is one last question in there that we haven't that we hadn't addressed, which was how do we share our stories in an increasingly ephemeral world, that somebody asked. And I'm actually going to tag on a question of my own to that, which is how do we listen better to the stories of others? Because we have been talking a lot about distance in time, and we talk about future generations and how our children will feel the crisis on their bodies, but the truth is that people are feeling the crisis on their bodies and have been for decades, in under different socioeconomic circumstances and in global south mainly. So my question goes that way as well. How do we share our stories, but also how do we get better at actually bridging that gap that privilege actually creates?
I think Andrew's book gives a really great example of that, because what he's doing is integrating, very personal family histories and telling a story that actually touches all of us. And in fact, I think the way that the family story is central and the climate story is sort of around the edges of it, sort of encapsulating it, I think is again a really effective way to do it. And the more that we, I guess, can all make that connection, between our own story and the wider story that's going on, I think the better. But your question about listening, of course, is vital, because you can't tease apart the hope and the grief. You can't tease apart the sense of urgency from the at times overwhelming sense of impossibility or dread. And we have to be aware that we will all be experiencing some version of this at some time. And so having a sense of respect and care for one another in that act of storytelling is essential as well. That you might be ready to tell the story, someone else might not be ready to listen to it. So how do you then engage fruitfully? But Andrew, what would you say?
Well, I think we just share stories like we've always shared stories. Bookstores are a good place to share stories, and then of course we have connected the whole world. So we're in a perfect situation of listening to stories from the front line of climate change, and the front line can be in Iceland, in a place where we have. You could say we have privilege, or we have, at least for now, we have prosperity. Nobody knows really what the future will bring, but then I was in contact with, actually through Instagram, I met a group of kids from Iran, and they were doing my play in a small village called Nairij in Iran, and they were telling me. They were experiencing 55 degrees of summer heat for the 5th year in a row, and that was kind of a real wake-up call, because you could really feel how crop failure comes from that, how that small town will move into the city, how people will understand that the city was actually thriving because of the small towns around it. So you could really feel this, how this is happening now, so how climate change is not something of the future, but how, just kids that you're communicating with now or a few years ago are already, hitting this roof of places that were habitable, becoming possibly uninhabitable, or needing really now to mitigate or find some kind of solutions to live within this reality, and so you could really feel the urgency. So I think we have all the tools to share stories, and we have all the tools to solve the problem, and we just have to start working on it.
Thank you for answering all of those questions. That's been absolutely amazing. We are going to draw the event to a close, but just as a reminder, we obviously have the books in the shop, and you can get them by popping into Lighthouse, which is open now, but also through the website. Both books are also part of a wee list that we did the other week, putting together, which is called Language and Ecological Crises, which has a bunch of books on them, which I think are all amazing, and they are all to do with different kinds of climate communication and finding language around these big issues, and they give different voices from around the world as well. So have a look at that if you want further reading after reading these two amazing books. Thank you so much, David, and thank you, Andri. It's been amazing having you. As soon as we turn the recording off, it's going to be very abrupt, so so we're just going to say a nice thank you before it just goes completely black. And thank you everyone who's tuned in. You will be able to catch this later as well if you want to listen back, if you want to watch back.
Thank you.
Thanks for hosting, Jeff.
Thank you.
Thank you.